The wind howled through the towering pines, rattling the wooden walls of Frank Harrison's cabin as he poured himself a fresh cup of coffee. The rich, dark aroma filled the warm interior, a stark contrast to the brutal cold just beyond the thick log walls. Outside, the world was locked in the grip of an unforgiving Alaskan winter. The kind Frank had grown accustomed to after years of living alone in this remote wilderness. At 68, he had seen more winters than he cared to count, each one a reminder of both the beauty and the cruelty of nature. His breath fogged the frosty window as he peered out, expecting the usual sight, nothing but an endless sea of white. The heavy snowfall burying the landscape in silence. But today was different. Today, something was waiting for him. Frank's heart skipped a beat as his eyes locked onto the hulking figure just outside his cabin. A massive grizzly, easily over 1,000 pounds, stood mere feet from his front door, its thick fur crusted with ice, its breath coming in slow, misty puffs. Frank had encountered bears before. Living in the wild meant sharing space with him, but this one was different. It wasn't sniffing around for food, nor was it prowling with the usual wariness of a wild animal. It stood still, almost expectant, and then, to Frank's utter disbelief, it raised one colossal paw and tapped against the window. The sound, soft yet deliberate, sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Bears didn't knock, they didn't request entrance, they didn't behave like this. Instinct told him to reach for the old shotgun propped up against the wall. But something else, something deeper, something primal, held him back. The bear's eyes, dark and intelligent, met his through the glass, and for a moment, the two simply stared at each other. Frank had seen wild animals in distress before, had seen desperation in the eyes of a starving wolf, the weary resignation of an injured elk. But this was something else. This was a request. Cautiously, he set his coffee down and moved toward the door. Every step measured, his breath steady. He unlatched it slowly, pulling it open just an inch, enough to let the cold rush in, biting at his skin. The bear didn't move. It stood there, enormous and silent, its thick fur quivering in the wind. Up close, Frank could see the frost clinging to its muzzle, the ice forming around its ears. It was suffering, but why had it come to him? Then he saw it. The bear shifted slightly, and Frank's gaze dropped to the creature's side. A deep wound, half hidden by fur, ran along its flank, blood frozen in the bitter cold. It must have been attacked, another bear. Maybe a pack of wolves. Whatever had happened, it had barely made it here. But why here? Why to him? Memories stirred, unbidden. Years ago, when he was still young, still a soldier, he had encountered something like this. A wounded soldier, too stubborn to call for help, waiting for someone to do what he couldn't. Frank knew that kind of pain. He had lived it, and now, here he was, face to face with a creature who, against all logic, had come to him in its time of need. Slowly, Frank stepped onto the porch, boots crunching against the ice. The bear didn't flinch. It simply stood there, watching. He didn't know what compelled him, what force in the universe had woven their paths together in this frozen wilderness. But he couldn't ignore it. "All right, big guy," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely more than a whisper against the wind. "Let's see what we can do." The bear made no sound as Frank moved closer. Carefully, he circled it, eyes scanning the wound. It was bad, but not fatal, not yet. He needed supplies, needed to get it inside, or at least somewhere sheltered from the relentless cold. His cabin was small, not built for guests, least of all one of this size. But he couldn't just leave it out here to freeze. Damn fool thing to do. He muttered to himself as he moved back inside, grabbing what little medical supplies he had. He was no vet, but he knew enough about survival, about pain, about what needed to be done. When he returned, the bear had sunk down onto its haunches, exhaustion finally winning out over whatever force had kept it standing. It let out a slow, heavy breath, and Frank swore he saw something in its eyes: trust. For the next few hours, man and beast faced the storm together. Frank worked carefully, cleaning the wound as best he could, speaking in low tones, not expecting the bear to understand, but finding comfort in the sound of his own voice. The bear didn't fight him, didn't lash out. It simply watched him, eyes heavy with exhaustion, but calm, as if it knew. By the time the worst was over, night had begun to fall, the sky turning a deep shade of blue, the temperature dropping even lower. Frank wrapped his coat tighter around himself as he stepped back, studying his work. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The bear would live, if it could make it through the night. With a final glance at his unlikely companion, Frank stepped inside, leaving the door slightly ajar. Just in case, he settled into his chair, the fire crackling beside him, casting long shadows along the walls. He expected sleep to take him quickly, but his mind was too full, his heart too heavy. Out there, in the dark, the bear rested, breathing slow and deep. Maybe it would be gone by morning. Maybe not. But something had changed in Frank that day. Something had stirred deep within him. Something he had thought lost long ago. In the silence of the Alaskan wilderness, with only the wind and the steady rhythm of another heartbeat to remind him he wasn't alone, Frank allowed himself, for the first time in years, to believe in something more. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the bitter cold that seeped into every crack of Frank's cabin. The fire inside crackled, casting flickering shadows against the log walls. But no warmth could reach the frozen world outside. Frank had been prepared for another long night. The kind where the only company was the distant call of a lone wolf or the whisper of snow shifting against the trees. But then, he saw them. At first, it was just movement, shapes in the swirling white, barely distinguishable from the storm itself. He stepped closer to the window, squinting through the frost, and his breath caught in his throat. A grizzly, larger than any he had seen in years, stood just beyond his porch, its thick fur coated in ice, the weight of exhaustion pressing heavily into its massive frame. But it wasn't alone. Behind her, 3 cubs huddled together, their small bodies trembling violently, their fur barely visible beneath the thick layer of snow clinging to them. One of them, the smallest, was no longer standing. Frank's gut twisted. He had seen enough suffering in his lifetime to know when something was at its breaking point. The little one was dying, and its mother knew it. The grizzly's breath came in heavy puffs, her sides heaving as she turned her gaze toward him. There was no aggression, no sign of the territorial fierceness Frank would have expected. Instead, there was something else, something deeper, more desperate. Then, to his astonishment, she moved closer and, with slow deliberation, raised a massive paw. The sound of her claws tapping against the frost-covered glass was eerie, unnatural, but there was nothing threatening in it. It was a request. Frank felt his throat tighten. He had spent his whole life understanding the way the wild worked. Predators and prey, strength and weakness. He had learned the hard way that nature did not bend for sentiment. And yet, this mother bear, this powerful, magnificent creature, was standing before him, doing something no animal should do. Begging. She turned slightly, looking back at her cubs, then did something even more incredible. Lowering herself onto her haunches, she used her claws to trace something in the frost on the window. The movements were slow, uncertain, but unmistakable, not just a mindless swipe of a paw, but an attempt at communication. Frank could barely breathe as he watched her. She lifted her great head again, her dark eyes locking onto his. Then, with a carefulness that seemed impossible for a creature of her size, She reached down and gathered the smallest cub in her massive forelimbs. Cradling it against her chest, she pressed its frail body gently against the glass, her breath fogging up the cold surface. The cub barely moved, its tiny sides rising and falling in shallow, uneven gasps. Its eyes, half-lidded with exhaustion, flickered toward Frank before slipping closed again. Frank swallowed hard. He had seen mothers like this before, not bears, but women, soldiers' wives, refugees in war-torn places, clutching their dying children, eyes filled with the same silent plea. Not for themselves, never for themselves, always for the ones they loved, the ones they would give anything to save. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was an old man, a man who had lived through war, who had survived more loss than he cared to remember. He had spent the last years of his life in solitude, convinced that the world had no more place for him, that he was done fighting battles. But this wasn't a battle. This was something else entirely. The bear let out a low, rumbling sound, something between a growl and a whimper, a sound of helplessness, of hope slipping away. Frank's body moved before his mind caught up. He turned, grabbing the thick wool blanket from the back of his chair, throwing it over his shoulders as he reached for the door. The cold slammed into him the moment he stepped outside. Sharp and unforgiving, but he barely noticed. His focus was on them. The mother bear did not move as he approached. She stood her ground, her breath steady but tense, watching him with the wary hope of something that didn't quite trust, but had no other choice. The cub in her grasp was barely breathing. Frank knelt in the snow, his fingers trembling as he reached out. He expected her to pull away, to recoil at the touch of a human hand. But she didn't. Instead, she lowered her head slightly, as if giving him permission, as if surrendering this last fragile hope into his weathered hands. The little body was almost weightless in his arms. Too cold, too still. Frank could feel the weak pulse beneath the fur, could feel the way life was slipping through the tiny thing like sand through his fingers. He had no medical supplies for an animal, no experience treating a cub like this. But he had warmth, he had fire. With slow, deliberate movements, he wrapped the cub in his thick coat, pulling it close to his chest as he rose to his feet. The mother bear let out another sound, softer this time. Questioning, Frank turned toward the cabin, pausing at the doorway, his heart pounding. He had no way of telling her what he intended, no way of making her understand that he wasn't taking the cub away forever. So he did the only thing he could. He nodded. The bear watched him, her massive shoulders rising and falling with deep, slow breaths. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she lowered herself into the snow, curling around her remaining cubs. Trusting him, Frank stepped inside, his arms wrapped tightly around the little life in his grasp. He moved swiftly, placing the cub near the fire, rubbing its fur gently, willing warmth back into its tiny body. Minutes passed, then an hour. Every so often, he glanced toward the window, where the mother bear remained, her massive form barely visible through the frost-covered glass. Finally, the cub stirred, a weak, shuddering breath, a tiny paw twitching against the thick fabric of Frank's coat. Relief flooded through him so hard it nearly brought him to his knees. He had spent so many years alone, so many years believing that his time of making a difference had passed. But tonight, in this remote corner of the world, with only the fire and the storm and the silent, watching eyes of a mother who had entrusted him with the most precious thing she had, Frank knew one thing for certain. He wasn't done yet. The night was silent except for the howling wind, the kind of bitter, bone-deep cold that could kill a man if he wasn't careful. Frank Harrison had lived through enough winters to know this one was worse than most. The storm had rolled in thick and heavy, swallowing the landscape in an endless sea of white. It was the kind of night where nothing moved. where the wilderness itself seemed to hold its breath. And yet, here he was, standing at his front door, staring at something he could hardly believe was real. The grizzly mother did not move as he stepped forward, her massive frame silhouetted against the swirling snow. The two remaining cubs huddled against her, their tiny bodies shivering uncontrollably. But it was the smallest, the weakest, that held Frank's attention. It lay motionless in her paws, its breathing so faint he could barely see the rise and fall of its chest. Frank was a man who had spent his life facing death. He had seen it on battlefields, in the hollowed-out eyes of soldiers who had lost too much, in the quiet, final moments of men who had fought too hard for too long. But this was different. This wasn't war. This wasn't some cruel twist of fate meted out by men with guns and grudges. This was a mother, in the purest, most desperate sense of the word, offering up the last of her strength in a plea that went beyond language. His fingers tightened on the doorframe, his mind screaming at him to think, to consider the risk. A bear in his cabin was insane. 3 bears? Unthinkable. And yet, when she moved, when she took that slow, careful step forward and, with more gentleness than Frank thought possible, placed her smallest cub just past the threshold, he did not back away. The tiny body barely stirred as it settled onto the wooden floor. Half buried in the folds of Frank's coat, the mother bear remained still, waiting, watching. Her breath came in deep, heavy puffs, curling into the frozen air. And then, after a long, agonizing moment, Frank did the only thing he could. He reached down and gathered the cub into his arms. The mother let out a low, guttural sound, but it was not a growl. It was something softer, something that sent a shiver down Frank's spine for reasons he couldn't quite name. He turned without a word and stepped inside, crossing the room in long, deliberate strides to place the little one by the fire. His hands moved instinctively, rubbing warmth back into its fragile limbs, checking for any sign of life. Behind him, a heavy shadow shifted. He turned just in time to see the mother bear place another cub on the doorstep. Frank swallowed hard. His instincts screamed at him to stop this before it went too far, before the natural order of things unraveled completely. But when he met her eyes, he saw only trust, a trust so profound, so absolute, that it made his chest ache. Slowly, deliberately, he nodded. One by one, the cubs were brought into the cabin. One by one, they were placed before the fire, their tiny bodies curling into themselves as the heat began to thaw the cold from their bones. And then, as if performing some impossible act of etiquette, the mother bear did something that nearly brought Frank to his knees. She wiped her paws in the snow. Frank stared, his breath catching in his throat as she stepped forward, carefully rubbing each massive foot against the frozen ground before taking her first step inside. It was impossible, it was absurd, but it was happening. This wild, untamed force of nature understood. She understood that this was a home, that this was not her space, not her territory. She was asking, not taking, seeking refuge, not demanding it. And Frank, for reasons he would never fully understand, let her in. The cabin, built for one man and no more, suddenly felt impossibly small. The mother bear took up nearly half the room, her bulk massive against the warm glow of the fire. The cubs, now sprawled across the floor, remained eerily still, not playing, not exploring. They simply sat, their dark eyes flickering between their mother and Frank. Waiting. Waiting for what? Frank wasn't sure. He wasn't sure of anything anymore. Minutes passed, then an hour. The fire crackled, sending waves of warmth through the tiny cabin, melting the frost from their fur, loosening the stiffness in Frank's fingers. He sat in his chair, hands curled around a half-forgotten mug of coffee gone cold, watching the impossible unfold before him. The mother bear settled herself against the farthest wall, her body still tense, but no longer fearful. She had done the unthinkable, trusted a man with the lives of her children. And now, she waited to see if he would betray that trust. Frank ran a hand through his graying hair, exhaling slowly. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, heavier than any rifle he had ever carried, heavier than any decision he had made in war. He could end this now. Open the door, force them back into the wild where they belonged. Pretend this had never happened. Or he could do what he knew, deep in his bones, was the only choice. With a sigh that felt like surrender, Frank pushed himself to his feet. He moved carefully, deliberately, stepping over the sleeping cubs, past the mother bear's watchful gaze, to the corner of the room where an old trunk sat covered in dust. He hadn't opened it in years, had almost forgotten it was there. Inside, neatly folded beneath old hunting gear and tools long unused, were blankets, thick, woolen, warm. Frank grabbed them without hesitation. Crossing the room once more, the mother bear tensed as he approached, her massive shoulders stiffening, but she did not move, did not growl, did not stop him as he bent down and, with slow, steady hands, draped a blanket over her cubs. The smallest one, the one that had been closest to death, stirred beneath the weight. A tiny sigh, barely more than a breath, escaped its muzzle as it burrowed deeper into the warmth. Frank straightened, his throat tight, his heart hammering harder than it should have been for a man his age. He met the mother's gaze one last time. She blinked, and then, slowly, carefully, she laid her massive head down beside her cubs, her breath steady, her body finally, at rest. Frank turned back to his chair, sinking into it with the kind of exhaustion that came from something deeper than just lack of sleep. He stared into the fire, the events of the night playing over and over in his mind. He had spent so many years alone, so many years convinced that the world had nothing left for him but the slow, inevitable march toward the end. And yet, in this tiny cabin, on this impossible night, with a mother bear and her 3 cubs sleeping at his feet, Frank Harrison realized something he had not felt in a long, long time. He was not alone. The fire crackled gently, casting a soft glow over the wooden walls of the cabin. Outside, the blizzard raged on, the wind howling like a restless spirit. But inside, there was warmth, quiet, and something else. Something Frank Harrison could only describe as impossible. He sat in his worn leather chair, his old hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, watching in stunned silence as the mother bear nudged one of his thick blankets over her cubs. It wasn't the simple fact that she did it, it was the way she did it. With slow, deliberate care, her powerful jaws delicately pulling the fabric, draping it over their tiny, sleeping forms just as any human mother might tuck in her children for the night. Frank's chest tightened. He had seen tenderness before, had witnessed moments of profound connection between creatures of the wild. But never like this, never so unmistakably human. The cubs, nestled close to the fire, let out soft, contented sounds, their tiny paws twitching in sleep. The mother bear, satisfied, settled herself down nearby, her watchful eyes never straying far from Frank. They had reached an understanding, an unspoken truce that felt more like something ancient, something sacred. This was no longer a chance encounter between man and beast. This was something deeper. Frank exhaled slowly, setting his coffee aside before reaching for the small tin of water he had placed by the fire to warm. He hesitated for only a moment before gently sliding it toward the cubs. They blinked drowsily at the offering, their dark eyes flicking toward their mother. And then, in a moment that sent another jolt of disbelief through Frank, they waited. The mother bear lifted her head, assessing the tin with quiet consideration. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, she gave her approval. Only then did the cubs move, their small muzzles dipping into the water, drinking carefully, not rushing, not fighting over it, just drinking. Frank let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. What kind of bear did this? He had spent a lifetime in the wilderness, had seen grizzlies tear apart a riverbank in pursuit of fish, had watched them claim territory with brutal force. He had never seen restraint, never seen respect, and yet, that was what this was. The smallest cub, still weak but recovering, nudged the tin with a sleepy paw, tipping it slightly. The water spilled onto the wooden floor, soaking into the old planks. Frank barely had time to react before the mother bear did something even more astounding. She moved forward and, using her massive nose, carefully pushed the tin back into place. Frank stared. She looked at him, her great head tilting slightly, waiting for his reaction. Jesus, he muttered under his breath, rubbing a hand over his face. You're something else. The bear simply blinked, settling back into place, curling protectively around her young. Frank leaned forward, elbows on his knees, shaking his head in disbelief. He had spent so many years alone in this cabin, believing he had seen everything nature had to offer. He had been wrong. Then, a soft shuffle of paws broke the silence behind him. Buddy, the old hunting dog, stepped out from his usual spot near the back of the cabin, his grizzled face lit by the fire. He had been watching, waiting, just as uncertain as Frank about what to make of their strange new guests. The dog's amber eyes locked onto the mother bear's, and for a long, tense moment, neither moved. Frank held his breath. He had no idea how this would go. A bear and a dog? It could turn in an instant. But then, the mother bear did something that sent shivers down his spine. She didn't growl, didn't lunge, didn't show her teeth. Instead, she did the opposite. She pulled her cubs back. A slow, careful movement, protective, but not aggressive. She placed herself between them and Buddy, not as a challenge, but as a boundary, a clear, deliberate gesture that said, I will not harm you, but I will protect my own. Buddy stood still for a moment longer, ears twitching. Then, just as slowly, he moved forward. Frank tensed. But Buddy didn't bark. He didn't snarl. He simply walked closer, sniffed the air, and then, in a decision that left Frank speechless, lay down beside the cubs. Not threatening, not challenging, just accepting. The mother bear watched, her muscles taut for a fraction of a second longer. Then, as if coming to the same silent conclusion, she relaxed. Frank let out a slow breath, his heart hammering in his chest. He had spent years trying to understand the way of the wild, believing it to be ruthless, indifferent. But this was something different. He watched as the cubs, still drowsy, scooted slightly toward Buddy, as if drawn to his warmth. Buddy let out a soft huff, but didn't move away. He accepted them, just as their mother had accepted him. Frank swallowed hard. He had spent so many years thinking he was alone, that the world had no place for him anymore, that he had seen all there was to see, done all there was to do. But as he sat there, watching a dog and a family of bears share the same space, share the same warmth, he realized how wrong he had been. There were still miracles left in this world. And tonight, in this tiny cabin in the heart of an Alaskan winter, he was witnessing one. The fire had burned low, casting a soft amber glow across the wooden floor, where the three cubs lay nestled together, their bodies warm and full of life once more. The mother bear sat nearby, her massive frame relaxed in a way that Frank never thought possible for a wild animal in the presence of a man. Over the past days, he had watched them heal, had witnessed moments of intelligence and emotion that defied everything he had ever believed about nature's divide between man and beast. And now, as the first light of dawn painted the snowy landscape outside in hues of pale gold, he knew, it was time. The mother bear rose first, stretching her powerful limbs before turning her gaze toward her cubs. They blinked up at her, still drowsy from sleep, but they understood. There was no growl, no command, just the silent communication of a mother and her children. Slowly, they stood. Frank had been preparing for this moment, had told himself he would not interfere, that he would let them go as quietly as they had come. But when he saw the smallest cub hesitate, turning its head toward the warmth of the fire, his chest tightened. He had saved them. He had kept them alive in a world that had nearly swallowed them whole. And now, they would leave, just as nature intended. The mother bear stepped toward the door, but before crossing the threshold, she did something that left Frank utterly speechless. She turned to her cubs, lowered her head slightly, and, with slow and deliberate movements, nudged them each toward the snowy floor just beyond the entrance. The first cub, catching on, stepped forward and wiped its tiny paws against the snow. The second followed, mimicking its sibling, brushing away any trace of dirt before stepping onto the porch. Frank could only watch in stunned silence as the smallest cub hesitated, looking up at its mother for reassurance. She gave a soft huff, and with a determined little nod, the cub did as it was told, rubbing its paws clean before scampering out into the cold. Frank let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But the mother bear wasn't finished. She turned back to face him, her dark eyes locking onto his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Then, with an eerie grace, she stepped forward, not aggressively, not hesitantly, but with purpose. Frank didn't move, didn't reach for his rifle, didn't even breathe as she raised one massive paw and, with an unthinkable gentleness, placed it on top of his hand. Time stood still. It wasn't just a touch. It wasn't just an accident. It was gratitude. A lump formed in Frank's throat as he stared at the impossible scene unfolding before him. He had spent a lifetime understanding the wild, surviving in it, respecting it, but never, not once, had he imagined that it might understand him in return. The moment passed as quickly as it came. The mother bear withdrew her paw, turned back to her cubs, and with a deep, steadying breath, she did something that shattered any last thread of doubt Frank had about the intelligence of these creatures. She raised her paw to her chest, held it there for a moment, then extended it forward. One by one, her cubs did the same. The first lifted its small paw to its chest, then extended it outward, an awkward but unmistakable mimicry of its mother's movement. The second followed, its motions more confident, as though it understood the weight of what it was doing. And then, the smallest, still weak, still tiny, looked up at Frank with wide, trusting eyes. It hesitated, then lifted its little paw to its chest, held it for the briefest of moments, and extended it forward. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it bowed its head. Frank felt his breath hitch, his vision blurring as he clenched his jaw against the sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion that crashed over him. He was not a man who cried. He had seen too much, lost too much, endured too much. But in that moment, standing in the doorway of his tiny cabin, watching 3 bear cubs and their mother offer him a farewell that defied every law of nature, he felt something crack open inside him. The mother bear turned, leading her young onto the snow-covered path that would take them back into the forest. But just as Frank thought the moment was over, she paused. With slow, deliberate care, she began using her paws to brush away the imprints they had left behind, covering their tracks in the fresh snow. She was returning the space to him as it had been before, as if she understood that this place, this cabin, was his sanctuary, and she would not take more than she had already been given. Frank swallowed the lump in his throat, gripping the doorframe as he forced himself to commit every detail of this moment to memory. The mother bear reached the tree line and turned once more. Then, with the same slow, Deliberate grace. She lifted her paw into the air. A wave. A farewell. A gesture that should not have been possible. And behind her, each of the cubs did the same. Frank stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but watch as they disappeared into the swirling snow. Their dark forms swallowed by the endless white. He didn't know how long he stood there, staring at the place where they had vanished. He didn't know how long the cold bit at his skin, or how long the fire crackled behind him, waiting for him to return to its warmth. But he did know one thing. He had just experienced something sacred, something unexplainable, something that no man would ever believe. And yet, as he finally turned back inside, closing the door behind him, he found himself smiling, just a little, just enough, as he whispered into the empty room, "Goodbye, old girl, safe travels." And in the silence, he could almost swear he heard the wind carry back a whisper in return.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.